Hello, this is Luana Rubin, and today I'm so thrilled to have Paula Nadelstern back with us for part two of our celebrity interviews. Paula and I are old friends, and we often get together in Houston or when we run into each other at other shows. And we love to just get together over, what do we get together over? A glass of wine or
Food.
yeah,
We're
food?
foodies.
Okay.
We
Okay. And get kind of chatty and gossipy. So part two, part one, I hope that you've seen that. If not, make sure you check it out. But part two is going to be a little bit different. Part one, we talked about Paula's career and her design work and her quilts and so on. We'll still talk about that this time, but this time we're going to get a little more personal, just because it's fun. And when girlfriends get together, you know what we do. We love to talk about things. But first, I would like to share with you a quote from Paula that's I think you'll find very inspiring. Until I met quilts, I thought I was creative, but not talented. To find something you love to do is a gift. To achieve recognition for it is a miracle. How about that? Where did that quote come from, Paula?
well, as I started to discuss, last time in the first one, I was trying to remember that, and then my brain took me off in a million other directions. And in my very first book with C&T, Kaleidoscope and Quilts, which is interesting why it's called Kaleidoscopes and Quilts, um, I I was telling you how I do everything very slowly, but that phrase just came to me. I'm in a two-bedroom apartment, with uh, and I was typing on a laptop, learning to actually use a laptop, like on in our foyer. When I first walk into this 1,000 square foot apartment, and my husband and daughter at home at the time were watching TV or something, and I remember just writing that out and turning around to face them and said, "Listen to what I just wrote," and I just like wrote that. Now, actually, what it says in the book is, and that's the introduction to my first, as I said, C&T book, Kaleidoscopes and Quilts. See, my brain just wanted to start telling you about that lawsuit that was all based on that book. But
Ah,
first, I'm going to finish this thought.
okay.
It actually goes on to say, you know, at that point, I was working on the kitchen table, in the kitchen, that I was lucky enough to have a kitchen in the kitchen, I mean, a table in the kitchen. Um, and, um, and I really was going on to say, and whenever I wished I had a room with a door to close, I try to remember that. I try to remember what a gift, becoming a quilt artist and becoming well known for it, and all this career and meeting people like you and going around the world. And, whenever what I was thinking was, oh, I work on the kitchen table and I don't have a place to work and I don't have a fancy sewing machine and I don't have this and I don't have that, but mostly what I don't have a door to shut and leave my stuff just the way I left it.
Mm.
What a gift, how finding what you love to do is such a gift.
Yeah, and Paula, I can relate to that because I did live in New York City for 6 years, and I've the first time I didn't exactly meet you, but I heard you speaking at our state guild meeting back in maybe 91. And you described working on your kitchen table, and I was just imagining my apartment when I lived in New York, just thinking, how did she do that?
Well, I think how I did that is, first of all, we love fat, we're gonna do it. I mean, that I had the time, that I had, that was, I was appreciative of that. I had been an occupational therapist. I was the first occupational therapist hired by the New York City Board of Education.
Oh,
Yep, I work with severely handicapped kids. That's why, I've said before, I don't have an art background. I don't have a academic art degree. And and it was a choice, me and my husband, that I would stay home. He was a teacher at the time. He went on through the New York City Board of Education all the way up till he became deputy chancellor of, a million kids and stuff like that. But because that was easier, I was happy to be home. And while I was home, um, I started quilting on the park bench. That's when New York City moms hang out. We don't have a backyard. I do not know why you'd want a backyard. Then you're alone with your kid in your backyard. You go across the street to the playground, and there's all the other moms to play with. Oh, that's
yeah,
play with each other. Forgot about that.
yeah.
Still to this day, I have dear friends who I met on the park bench, and and our kids,
Mhm.
people still really aware of it. And that's when my serious quilting started,
Mhm.
because there was another mom who was a great, who wrote wonderful articles for the nursery school newsletter. And I asked her, and one of the, and truly, it started because I said to the other moms on the bench, hey, let's make a quilt, to fundraise. Now I had gone to that nursery school as a baby,
Mhm.
maybe years before that. I live on the same block where I was born. And
Yeah.
so um, I was very happy to be part of the nursery school now as a mom, and we did a fundraising. We made a quilt. The woman who was in charge of the fundraiser, when somebody won it, um, and didn't really want a quilt, she was smart enough to say, well, how would you like $100 instead? And that quilt, which was made, my daughter's 44 and was made when she was like 3, um, is still hanging in the nursery school down the block. And
Oh,
since the moms have made a quilt every year, and I asked, after a year of making group quilts with different organizations, I asked this other mom, um, Linnell Hancock, and that Hancock comes from from the Hancock that we all know. She's many generations American, and her
ah,
family, well, she was writing for the Village Voice and doing all these things her parents weren't as proud of back in Iowa. And I was making the quilts when I don't have anyone in my background who makes quilts. There was nothing,
mm,
did not make quilts. They just stuffed the goose and got enough goose down to make a quilt. But patchwork
mm.
was just part of my background. Anyway, Linnell and I wrote a book together for Crown in 1986 called Quilting Together. And
Wow.
it was a hardcover, square book, so it didn't really fit on your bookshelf that well, and then we made a quilt. The president of Crown, the founder of Crown, I don't remember, it was his big birthday, big something. And so they asked me to make a quilt with them, which is actually on the cover of the book. Um, and each block is a different bestseller. So there's a couple of
Oh,
funny, if you don't mind my going into this, but it was funny because it's just a block, block, block kind of thing. And one of their best sellers was the joy of sex, right? What? And
mm.
so when we finished this quilt, another thing that was fun was that I would bring a fabric down on the subway and I'd spread it out in a conference room. And the only
Oh,
people who actually came to make a quilt, not was the creative staff there, but were the accountants. Those are the people who wanted to learn how to make a block and make quilts and do embroidery and all that. It was fun. And then when it was finished, Linnell's mom knew an Amish woman in the area
mm.
in Iowa, and we sent the quilt to her to
Oh,
and years later, used in someplace, people came to me and said, "Oh, I saw when that quilt was being quilted." And so, at
oh,
um, when it got to the point where they were going to quilt the Joy of Sex block or something like that, they would put a top something over it so nobody could actually see what the block was.
oh.
The
Well,
Amish women.
Paula, I have a different 1980s park bench story
Okay.
um, that I will share with you that's very different from yours. I was living in the East Village. So I lived in the East Village from 84 to 90. And I lived, I had a store across the street from Tompkins Square Park and also a gallery. And then I lived down the street on 10th Street next to the Russian Baths. So some of
Oh,
you who are familiar with New York will be familiar with those landmarks. But at the time, we had a homeless population. There were about more than 300 people who were living in the park. There was a lot of crime. We would often wake up with needles or bodies on the front, on the front step. And so when I had my first kid, I was out of there because, obviously a playground full of needles and, people without a home and a lot of crime and drug use and so on was not a great place. So I love New York and I love hearing your stories about living in New York all of your life. But
you got the
the end of
time
my
that you
story,
were living there? At the time you were living there, do you remember on Houston Street, close to the FDR Drive, there was an old school building. I mean, it still is there, but it's
Mhm.
and beautiful. But while you were living there, my husband was working in that building. My
Oh my
mother,
God.
an immigrant at age 8 years old to America, went to that school. But now here we are in the 80s, and my husband
Mhm.
was actually working there. And
Mm.
he talks about how, one day somebody came out of the building to, they sometimes you'd have to park on the sidewalk because there was no other place. And he came out to, to his little Toyota or VW or something like that, and the wheels were gone. It
Oh,
was
oh my God.
but yeah, that was
Well, I had a Ukrainian friend who had grown up in the East Village when it was a Ukrainian area. And I don't know, are the Ukrainian restaurants still there in that area? Do you know?
there's that one famous one. And when
Yeah.
I got married in 70, I was down at the Ukrainian postcard store, and that's where I got postcards to write as my thank you notes to send to everyone.
Mm.
Artwork so much from that area. Yeah,
And
down
then
there.
there used to be, I think it was on 6th Street, maybe between, I don't know, off of First and Second, there was a whole block of Indian restaurants. Do you
India
remember that?
more up in the 30s. Yeah, the 30s is the 30s on the east side
Well, at
now.
that time,
But
it was on 6th Street down in the East Village, the whole
but
block.
let's put it this way: I probably could not even afford a two-bedroom in that area anymore.
Oh,
I mean, it's
oh, well, nobody could. Yeah. So in 1990, when I moved here, I had a one bedroom and I had one of the first renovated buildings. And this is when I lived like a block away from Cher, who lived in that tall building that faced the park, you know? And we paid 1,500 for a one bedroom apartment. And last time I checked, it was over 5,000. I think it was headed towards 6,000 for a one bedroom. Yeah. But at the time, I was paying 1,500 for a one bedroom, and I moved to Colorado, and I bought a whole house on a piece of land on a corner lot, and my mortgage was 800 something, and then I refinanced, and my mortgage went down to 600 something. So, and then I actually had a vegetable garden. You talk about
oh,
backyards. Yeah, but of course, there are things in New York that you can't find anywhere else, and that's why I try to travel back to New York once a year because I love going to Broadway and the opera and things like that. Do you have a chance to get out and do things
you
like
know,
that?
since the pandemic, have not been to a Broadway show. Desperate to see Some Like It Hot. I've been asking people.
Yeah.
Bonds who's to New York. Next time you come into New York, we're going to see Some Like It Hot. Okay.
Oh, let's do that.
I'm
Yeah.
looking for somebody. I want to do that a lot. But we both have some, medical problems. So we were pretty cautious and, being in a theater. So I have
Mhm.
that. But um, yeah, there have been some really excellent exhibits. And here's a little tip for people coming into New York. I have found since the pandemic, I guess, I'm not really sure why, but Mondays, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is open and it's
Yeah.
free. I think people think the Met is not open or
Oh,
something like that. So it's lovely out there on a Monday,
yeah.
Monday morning.
That's cool. Well, I used to come after spring quilt market every May. I used to go to a show, to the Surtex show at the Javits Center, and then I would go to the costume exhibit at the Met. And I had a friend, Evie, well, she's still my friend. She's retired now, but she was the art director at Kaufman
Know
Fabrics.
her?
Yeah, yeah.
Evie and I used to always look in Houston at what shoes you were bringing that year. We would share
Oh,
shoes. We loved each other's shoes.
oh,
I
that's
like
great.
very creative woman.
Well, so we would always meet to go to the Javits Center, and then we go to the Costume Institute. And I don't know about you, but I think my favorite one was the Alexander McQueen exhibit. That
And
was
I was
just
very lucky
incredible.
because my good quilt friend Robin Schwab worked at the Met, and she was able to take me and a couple of other people in on an evening when it
Oh,
was closed.
yeah.
And then here's a funny story. So many years later, I was teaching in Dubai.
Mm,
Abu Dhabi or Dubai. I actually first taught in Abu Dhabi, but then this was Dubai. And we
hmm
weren't supposed to tell this to anybody, but the teachers was me and Sue Nichols and Sue Price, and also the wonderful Maria, the wonderful woman who does the applique from Spain, Rosa.
Oh yeah, Rosa.
Rosa. So the four of us get invited to Sheikha Shama's house. She's like the granddaughter. I mean, I'm not talking house. You get invited to her mansion. You know, what do you call Sheikha's? You know, it's amazing. It's unbelievable. And we get invited to have dinner with her, which was magnificent. And actually, Rosa was going to give her a quilting lesson. She really wanted to learn quilting. Everyone goes off to this bathroom, which is like being in the bathroom. I don't, you know, it's just magnificent.
The size of your apartment, right?
It's more than, yes. It's the
Yeah.
size of my apartment. They go off to the bathroom and I'm there with the Sheikha. And guess what I'm wearing? Guess what color I'm wearing? You can do it. What is Paula? I'm wearing black. I always wear black. It's my native costume. I'm wearing black. And Sheikha Shama, she's a young girl. She's like 21 years old. She looks at me, she goes, "Oh, you remind me of McQueen. You know, you remind me of Alexander McQueen." And I'm thinking, what is that? I loved it. I gave her a present. We each gave her a present. I gave her a display print of one of my kaleidoscopes.
Ah,
but boy, was that food was great. It was a lovely, fun evening.
Oh yeah.
Being told to remind McQueen, that was pretty cool.
My friend Pam Holland, I don't know if you know Pam, but she has a similar story. I wonder if it's the same person, you know, visiting or meeting somebody like that there. I'll have to check with her about that. I'll have to interview her sometime.
Teaching I don't know if it was Colorado. We were teaching like Colorado. Pam was next room. For some reason, my students kept stealing a stuffed kangaroo that she had. And there was this thing going on between these two classes. I was oblivious for a while, but finally I realized it was that Pam had this cardboard or stuffed kangaroo, and my students would grab it and bring it back, and then they would grab, built those students, you just can't, you can't get them to obey.
Oh, yeah.
Pam's quite amazing.
Pam and I have a lot in common, but we were originally introduced because we both had adopted a child from another country, which is a topic you and I have talked about before. She had adopted 15 children and fostered 150 kids.
My God.
She would do things like walk into a slum in India and find a dying baby on a slab of cardboard and bring that baby home and save its life and adopt the child. We have adopted, one child,
I've adopted
Sophie.
I have adopted one child, Ariel.
Right. So that's something that we have in common too. Oh, I was going to say one more thing about the McQueen show. So, digital printing is really taking over our industry. I think that more than half, maybe even 2/3 of what we carry now, excluding solid fabrics, are digital printed. And I've been told that in the next 3 to 5 years, pretty much the whole industry is going to shift to digital. You may have mixed feelings about that. But the only reason that I still love screen printing is, well, for collections like yours that have to be done with screen printing, but also for metallic printing. But what I was going to tell you is, I remember the very first time I saw a digital printing machine. I was at the textile show at the Los Angeles Mart, and I saw this machine printing out digitally, and I just stopped in my tracks and went, oh my God, this is the next big thing. That was like at least 15 years ago. It took a long time for it to come to our market, and it took a long time for the quality to be right, the price to come down and the quality to develop, and for them to be able to print something that's color fast on cotton, et cetera, et cetera. But so when was that McQueen show? You think that was like 8 or 9 years ago?
With the pandemic in between, it feels like everything was either 3 years ago or 10 years ago.
I know.
But it was, how many shows they had since? So I bet it was.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It was just a knockout. And the whole concept of being this to a museum of that quality. And since then, there have been quite a few, but nothing was ever quite like that.
Well, a lot of textile trends start in couture, right? So like the ombre dyed look that started in couture, but also often it's mirrored in our industry or with our textile artists. So at the time that ombre or gradient dyeing was showing up in the fashion shows in New York and Europe, textile artists were dyeing and creating ombre dyes. And so at the same time that, we were starting to explore digital printing, Alexander McQueen was just blowing the lid off the potential of digital printing. And I just remember going to that show. And of course, many of the things in the show were many years old at that point because, and he had died at that point, right? That was
Yes.
after he had passed. But I just remember going to that show and getting kind of teary-eyed because I remember that first time I saw that digital machine. And here was somebody who had just like totally exploited the potential. And now we all got to follow and be inspired by that.
And then that's gone full circle because now somebody has just taken a quilt and wrapped himself around, and worn it up the stairs of the, without really any tailoring to it or anything, but just right up, on the first month of May, the first May.
Now that was a year ago, right?
I think it was only a year ago.
Yeah, and I actually
Nice.
I met the young man who created that quilt. Actually, I met him. His name is Zach Foster, I think. And I met him at the International Quilt Museum, and I had dinner with him and Carolyn Maslumi.
Oh,
So
wow.
you and I recently had dinner after you spoke at the International Quilt Museum, and let's see, the director Leslie of the museum was there too,
And also Marianne Fons. There was
oh, Marianne Fons was there too. Yeah, talk about a power dinner. Holy cow!
So much fun. But I did want to say one thing going back to the digital because
yeah.
I was actually my last collection before the pandemic and my couple and a collection through the pandemic. We did digital. I was, Benetech said wanted me to go, and so 2019 collection was, but it just, after 1 or 2 years, I mean, maybe if we'd had been, first of all, that was such a difficult year because here this was getting printed and there was no communication and mills shut down. And so it was for me one of my favorite collections in terms of the artwork that we did, because the whole idea of duets and the whole idea was that we took two previous patterns and put them on top of each other and see them. Because now we didn't have to worry about how many colors it was. And we didn't just do that. I mean, we engineered it, we finessed it. And there's a couple of patterns from that I still really, really love, but I wasn't in the office. Nobody, there was some real big mistakes. The other thing for me is really, so going so many colors, hundreds, was a thrill. I did kaleidoscopes on top of kaleidoscopes. Also, you didn't have to have 3 colorways. It wasn't like you had the screen, the screen print, so you wanted to do the max, use them. You could just, even if on the one where there's, just kaleidoscopes on top of kaleidoscopes, the next colorway is not the same kaleidoscope. So, they're just placed. So there was some positive things about it, but it was not as black as I really needed to be. Now, maybe get there, maybe they are getting there. But, just in the couple of years I have left to design, I'm happy. So Benetech has gone back to screen printing, but there was certainly a couple of, and then the other thing is I just love marbled fabric. I love, and so we did a few of those that also, I know Benetech has done a couple of ones I love in extra wide, what is it, 104
inch? 108, right.
And I love those, and I do love the marbled stuff, and there's a couple things I have tried to do, which since we're doing screen printing again, I can't get to do. And I absolutely love these prints.
Yeah.
So maybe you'll see them someday, but yeah,
well,
it has definitely.
Only you can be the judge of the best way to produce your own.
It's me with
vision.
Benetech.
Yeah. And, actually, I originally thought that your work would be fantastic in digital because then you wouldn't have any color limitations. But there were some other issues that came up, and so I support you in that. And, my background as a garment and textile designer, I know that the most successful designers are the ones that get involved in the technical process, whether it's the layout or the development of the colors, getting involved with correcting strike-offs and so on. it's great if you work for a company that has a wonderful art director who can handle all that, but there are not many great art directors
I
left in
will
the
say,
industry
I
now.
still, Better Tech still
Yeah,
does have great. I mean, Ruth
yeah.
Beck, the art director I work with, she's very knowledgeable. She's a lovely person. So there
Mhm,
are, and I don't have that knowledge. Now, it's kind of,
mhm,
is you see, you know, as a quilting teacher, which is really my main focus, and a quilt maker who wants to make quilts, you know, that's, you know,
mhm.
a year, you know, there's just so much you could do. You know, it's almost like there's this, remember those old fashioned Chinese restaurants where there was a column A and a column B and, you know, and you'd pick from, you know, from this. And it's almost like what we have to do. You could teach, you could travel, you could write books, you could design fabric, you could learn how to do the mechanics of designing fabric, but you seriously can't do it all. You'll make yourself crazy.
Right.
And so you have to put your
But
trust. I was lucky
I,
with CNC. I put my trust in their ability to
yeah,
do books.
but you knew that you needed that dark black, and you were able to say that screen printing is going to work better for your designs. That's what I meant.
And also that we need symmetry, that we need someone who understands that when you say,
Mhm,
if the audience is going to trust that I'm going to make it symmetrical, you
right,
know, right, that really, if you take a template and you put it here and then you flip that template over, it's going to land on the same, you know, motif here, you
right.
know, and that's hard for someone else to explain, because if I'm just looking at a piece of fabric for a dress, for, I mean, I something not for my kind of quilt, I like asymmetry. I think too much symmetry can be boring. You know, I actually,
Mhm,
when something's you know, done by hand, and has is the illusion of symmetry. I call those pseudo symmetrical prints. They're a little bit off. I think that's more fabulous,
mhm,
but work for me. You know, I need to trust myself today at what I'm doing. I'm cutting out a left, and I'm using the same exact template flipped over on a round kaleidoscope to get the motif. And if that kaleidoscope is not round the way it's supposed to be, it's not
mhm.
going to. And and people will assume that we've done it that, and then get annoyed, and I don't blame them.
Well,
To
I have
do.
a question for you, Paula. So you have been teaching classes for such a long time. And when you teach your technique to people, there's a danger that they will just create quilts that look like Paula Nadelstern knockoffs.
Let
And
me
I
show
think
you.
you and I have talked about this before, but it's a danger, you know, it's like when a quilt artist becomes successful and people start inviting them to come and teach, there's a danger that, yeah, your students will just start creating your quilts, and they may have a quilt that's not quite as precise that Paula would, and they'll be at a show and people will look at it and go, gee, is that a Paula quilt? I don't know, it's not exactly perfect. So
You have to really pick your
yeah.
battles. I will, if you, I will send you a link. I wrote an article for Quilters Newsletter about that exact thing, the art
Mm,
of teaching. And I think it's one of the best things I've ever written. And it talks about that, about how, you know, the studio artist runs the risk of being redundant, you know, of being, you know, if too many people do the work in their style. And I
right.
do remember going back to the beginning before Sakwa started, you know, before all that, where that was such a major conversation, where people were saying, and I could name names, I could say Nancy Crow said it, and
Yeah.
different people said, do not, you know, don't teach what you do, because exactly what how you articulated so well. And yet Nancy
Mhm,
teach classes, because ultimately teaching is a wonderful thing to do if you're an innate teacher, and I believe that I
mhm,
am a good teacher. You know, I think the fact that I wrote books uh that facilitated the writing, because back and forth, you know how to say things because you've taught, and then when you go to write the things and you're trying to make them in a way that makes people easy to read them, then when you go back to teach, you know a better way to say it, and you know the steps, so those two things work off of each other.
mhm.
But I mean, it depends. That was my choice of not selling the work, or not turning work into, where I was making the same quilt for the person who was going to, over and over and over again. But there's just
Mhm.
so much. And early on, that that I did think about that, going back 30
Yeah.
years and 20. And then it's sort of like, go make a quilt like mine. I don't care. You can, if you can, looks like that, go and make a quilt. Like that would
Yeah.
be one.
Yeah.
And the fact that I've had so many people have you know what, that original quote, what I said, so many people have come to me and said, seeing your work changed my direction, my life, because a new way to be creative and how much I
Mhm.
I mean, who gets that? So
Yeah,
I understand what you're saying, but if your own work is, you have to make choices, and if your own work is unique enough, I mean, certainly I've been in places where people have assumed that someone's work is mine, and it's like,
mhm.
I
Yeah,
mean, it's a bunch of numbers, it's a bunch of, so 20 times that's happened. I don't know.
yeah,
So if
yeah,
it happened all the time, maybe you'd think differently. But in the end, you know, teaching was a living.
yeah.
Teaching and writing, and certainly none of it, okay, none of it, it's all together that it becomes a living. I mean, think of how many of the well-known quilters we know who didn't have that husband who had health insurance. Going back to the fact that my husband didn't have had a career in the New York City Board of Education meant that I never had to think about health insurance. And so many people
Mhm.
did and do.
Yeah.
And I don't live in Manhattan. I live in the North Bronx. Again, I
Mhm.
make not as high as it. You do make all those kind of choices. And for me, and I like teaching. I don't,
Yeah.
and I may not be doing much of it in the future. I have two week-long classes like signed up. That's it.
Mhm. Well, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of a few contemporary quilters who have kind of come to the fore in the last 5, 6, 7 years. A couple of them have become, won prizes, become very popular teaching, and yet, there are quilts that are clearly like I have to look at them twice, go, oh, is that so and so? I won't name names of the couple people I'm thinking of, but I will tell you a story about somebody else since you mentioned Nancy Crow. Um, I have been lucky to spend some time with Maria Schell, who's up in
I
Anchorage,
love
Alaska.
Maria Schell.
Yeah,
I love
she's
her
great.
work. I love her. Yeah. And I also
So she,
admire Nancy so much. I want that on the record that I think Nancy has just been such an icon. I mean, she's given
oh
so
yeah,
her recent lecture, her recent talk in the past couple of weeks for textile talks was
yeah,
fantastic.
absolutely. And it was one of the highest attended talks.
It was
And
great.
you probably know this, we're a sponsor of those textile talks. So
Nice fun.
for any of you who don't know what that is about, if you Google SAQA, SAQA textile talks, it'll pull it up and you can sign up for their newsletter and you can look at Nancy Crow's talk, you can look at all the past talks
Okay.
and sign up for the future. Yeah. But let me finish what I was going to say about Maria. So I met Maria when I was up in Alaska on a bear photography trip where I went out into the wilderness to photograph the grizzly bears fishing in the river. And she talked about that she had studied with Nancy Crow, but that she knew that she ran a risk of looking like Nancy's work. So she took everything that she learned from Nancy and she began to develop, her own style. And clearly she has, she still works with piecing of solids, but she's developed something that's very distinctively hers. And I give her a lot of credit for that she was able to make that transition.
And one of my close friends from the Manhattan Quilters Guild, which is the guild I've been in for over 40 years, Beth Carney, also took classes with Nancy and has
Mhm.
developed very much so. And I think quite a lot of people have. And that's sort of almost that Japanese, you learn with the master and then you go off, first. But none of us knew. I mean, none of us knew what the direction was going to be
Mhm.
of artists and quilt making and that sort of thing. And look what it became. But yes, that was one of the very major concerns of certainly the Manhattan Quilters Guild. We talked about quite a bit. Not a lot of us became teachers on the circuit. And then there's being on the circuit. I mean, you're on the circuit, you're not necessarily being an art at the time. Back then, you're not necessarily being an art quilter as much. You won't have as big a following. You won't be able to, people but you eventually, when I first was teaching, people would say, but you have to bring something with you. You have to have, you're not going to make a lot of money. And if you consider, if you are packing for a day and traveling for a day and teaching for 2 days and then coming home and unpacking, you've basically spent five days for those 2 days that you're getting paid for.
Yeah.
Certainly plane tickets paid for, your hotels, but when
Mhm.
people think you get paid so much, it's like, no, you don't. You know, you've really been 3 extra days for whatever it is. And
Right.
I've lost my train of thought, but so people would say you must bring, you know, you have to have a product. I'm thinking, I'll never have a product. And then eventually I designed fabric and I had books and I have, you know, some type of, and it's like, then you got to ship it all and store it all,
Yeah,
you know, but that is definitely the way that
yeah.
a person can actually make some money. You know, so
I
when people
think,
get annoyed that you're in the back, you know, in the back of the room, there's like a little store. Well, just give them a break because
yeah.
we're all hustling.
When I ran into you in Winnipeg, do you remember that time?
I
We
do.
briefly talked about that in part one. I think you had schlepped is the right word. You had schlepped a suitcase full of stuff that you had laid out. And but as I recall, it sold out. And I was there to say, hey guys, no problem. We carry it at Equilter because we're
Well,
huge fans of Paula's.
on that trip, if you remember, you said something about how you would get on that trip. My plane went on fire. We went back to New York. Then another thing happened. I mean, we ended up, I mean, I got there like 1 in the morning without a suitcase, without underwear. I mean, and then and the hardest place for a American teacher to teach is Canada. To go
Oh,
across the border is the hardest. You could go to Dubai, you could go to Japan. I mean, nobody asked us a thing.
hmm.
Japan, you have to have this letter of like authenticity. You have to have saying you're the once somebody told me they were thinking of inviting me to teach at the Canada, the big national, you know, festival, Canada
Yeah,
festival.
Quilt Canada.
Quilt Canada. And she said, I can't, you can't teach here because there's someone in Canada who teaches kaleidoscope quilts, which is really funny because the person she meant was a woman who worked for me and was a dear friend and was, you know, like doesn't want to teach and work, you know, all of that stuff. Doesn't
Yeah,
matter. But still,
yeah.
there are, I don't think this is just a rumor. This is real true. Like just who are going across the border with some of their quilts, and then they say, well, they're not for sale. And you know, at the border, and the border guard, the Canadian border guard will write NFS in marker on their quilt, not for sale. Because
Oh,
you know, you're just not supposed to go across and sell anything. You're not supposed to. So I had these letters. I mean, I got
oh,
to teach in Canada, you know, and one that night in Winnipeg, I remember this so clearly. There was a guy who looked like that. Oh, what do they call the Canadian? Not rock, the Canadian Mounties. So he
Mounties, yeah.
like he looks like that cartoon character, and he's trying to give me information. It's like 1 in the morning, and I just and he goes, "Okay, so have you taught here before?" I go, "Yeah, I've taught here before." Well, do you think? I don't know when. Well, do you think you might? He's looking at the computer. He's got all that information, and he's saying, "Well,
Oh,
do you, maybe you taught here in January?" Yeah, maybe. You know, he was just trying to feed me to help me through. You know, because I had to, but I did have a letter saying, "We are so," from the guild saying, "We are so lucky to have her. She's the best in the world, and only she can do this." And you know,
yeah.
and visa because otherwise it was hard to teach there. Take you to learn. And while I was there, they were talking to some native another Rocky was talking to the some Native Americans who were coming across to teach the First Nation people some computer skills, and he was
Oh,
giving a really hard time saying, "Are you sure nobody here in Canada can do that? Why are you coming all the way?" You know, like not wanting to let them in. It's like,
wow.
wow, we've had some.
I think it's easier to go to Canada now. I had some really bad experiences, I would say, during the Obama years. I don't know why, but you know, like they would dump everything in my purse into that filthy plastic bin, you know, like including my lipstick and my hairbrush in the same bin where people are putting their shoes.
And worse, yeah.
It was terrible.
And
Well,
worse. And you were
I've
lovely.
written,
Every time I met the Canadians, the women were just fabulous.
oh
You know.
yeah, of course. Um, I've written a letter like that for a teacher to come to the US, you know, who's coming to teach here at Equilter. We're not having those classes now, and of course we had to cancel classes when the pandemic started, which was very sad.
I was supposed to
I
go.
know, I know.
So I
It
was
was
looking forward to it. I
terrible.
have not been I haven't been to Boulder since my husband and I were there to take courses when we were both when I worked for the schools and he was a teacher. We had the summer off. and we
Hmm.
went to the University of Boulder. So we are talking about 1972. I was
Yeah.
probably in Boulder.
Oh, wow. Well, speaking of University of Colorado, you had asked before we started recording about what happened to Sophie. So I'll just add something here. So Sophie has now, she's decided that she doesn't want to be a Sophie because there's so many Sophies out there in the world. So she's going by Quinn, which is kind of an Americanization of her middle name, which is her Chinese name that was given to her in the orphanage. So now she goes by Quinn. And I've
Quinn,
been
I
just,
love Quinn.
yeah,
I just
well,
love Sky Quinn. I love that.
that was my idea when she was complaining about being a Sophie. I said, well, why don't you go by Quinn? It's kind of your middle name. Her Chinese name is spelled Quinxin. Of course, that's not how it's pronounced. But anyway, so if anybody's confused about that, when I write about her on Facebook these days, I say Sophie Quinn so people can kind of get what's going on. Anyway, yeah, 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone rings this morning, and it's Sophie, and she's crying hysterically. I don't think she would mind me saying that because I would be crying hysterically, saying that her apartment building was on fire and she had grabbed her violin and her laptop and her keys, and she was out on the street with all the other residents, and there were three fire trucks, and the kicker was that her jury, which is like her semester end test, playing her violin, that her jury was early this morning in Denver. So she was
Oh,
supposed to, this was at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she was supposed to get up at 7 and drive to Denver and play her jury. So of course she was just hysterical. Oh, my mom, what am I going to do? I'm going to flunk my jury, blah, blah, blah. So we were out of bed and we were waiting. I said, bring your roommate, just come over here. But it turned out an hour later that it wasn't the building on fire. It was somebody had left their car running in the underground parking lot, and it filled up with smoke and then filled up the building with smoke. And
oh.
somebody called the fire department, and when she came out of her apartment, it looked like the building was on fire. But that I spoke to her this afternoon. She said there's still an odor in her apartment. So I said, come home. But anyway, that's what happened last night. So none of us got very much sleep last night.
But what about did she go to Denver this morning for the jury?
Yeah, she went, and she feels, considering what happened, that she did well on her jury. So, we hope that that is true, that that's the case.
Please tell her that that's really one of my favorite names ever. I just have
Oh,
a thing for Quinn and for Finn.
oh, good. That's good. You had also asked me about my recent trip. What do you want to know?
Well, how was it? What did you see? Well, you
Oh,
can't
well,
sing, but
yeah, yeah. It was great.
you can France?
I went
France.
to the Pour l'Amour de Fil, the quilt festival that's put on by Quilt Mania magazine in Nantes, France.
I have
And
actually been.
okay, and this is the second time I've been there. So we were a sponsor. We were a sponsor for the Russian artist Gala Grotto. And, she has a really interesting story. I own one of her quilts. Um, she fled Russia about 15, 16 years ago. She went to Ukraine. She fled for her artistic freedom, and then she had to leave Ukraine even for the same reason. When the war started a year ago, she had to evacuate her daughter. So I wanted to go and see her. We sponsored her gallery, and then the quilt that I own of hers and a quilt that I've made recently were hanging on the end piece of the gallery. Anyway, we were a sponsor. I was a speaker there. I spoke on the topic of art and activism, which I'm going to be speaking at the Quilt National opening in a few weeks at the end of May. Um, I was a juror for the contest. They had a lovely little contest of Dutch theme quilts made by French quilters. Uh, and I just got to hang out and see a lot of friends from Europe who I hadn't seen for a long time. Anyway, I was at the Nantes show for 3 days. And then I don't know if you know this, but Nantes is at the mouth of the Loire Valley and the river there. So I took a really short little river cruise to go up into the first part of the Loire Valley. And unfortunately, the boat can't go all the way up the valley because guess what? The river is really low. So they can also
friends who
go,
have been on the, who've gone for those river cruises, exactly, right.
yeah,
They
there are a lot of problems with
France
it.
during the strike and the drought. So
Yeah.
that was,
Oh, yeah. So the protests were going on 1 block from my hotel. I stayed just a half block away from the chateau there. All the teachers were in the same
sounds
hotel and we
great.
would take the tram, but the protests were happening every night in front of the chateau. So I got to see and hear that for 3 nights. And the last night there were, I saw people with hammers breaking glass. I mean,
Mm.
I walked through the protest. I never felt unsafe. But it was an interesting experience. I don't know, you've probably been in the middle of riots and protests since you live in New York. No, I have.
My husband was in the riots in '68 in France. That's about as,
Mm.
he was my boyfriend.
Oh,
That's,
okay.
but
Yeah,
you're reminding me, like right now, it's like, oh, I want to go. I want to travel. I haven't worked.
yeah,
So when you talk about it and meet and see your friends and stuff like that, it
yeah.
makes me want
Well,
to do it.
maybe we should travel together, Paula. We'd have
That'd
fun.
be great, but you're coming to New York soon, and we're gonna, and we're gonna
I hope
see.
so. Some Like It Hot, that's one of my favorite all-time movies.
We just
I
saw it.
actually,
We saw it on TV recently because of that, because I've been saying how much I want to go. And I was actually almost going to get to go with Mary Ann Fonz, but it didn't quite work
oh,
out. I need a new date.
I actually met Tony Curtis when I lived in West Hollywood.
Really?
Yeah. Later years, obviously.
I believe he grew up, in this area, in the Bronx.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah.
Oh, well, I'll tell you quickly about the rest of the trip. So I had a couple days of, visiting castles, and I got to see the giant mechanical creatures there in Nantes. It's famous for these Jules Verne type huge mechanical animals. You've probably seen pictures of the gigantic mechanical elephant, for
Okay.
instance. I bet you've seen that. And then I flew to Amsterdam and I arrived the night before King's Day, which is a giant, crazy party. Everybody wears orange. They get on boats and they float around the canal, playing loud music, drinking Heineken beer and dancing. And I actually, I put some videos of that on my photo page. Actually, there's a bunch of photos from the trip, including a couple videos of that. And then like the whole city is just wasted the next day. Everything's
He's all
covered in
wearing
broken
orange. I love
glass
that.
and garbage.
Wearing
But
orange.
it was weird. At first, I was kind of taken aback because I had just been in these protest crowds in Nantes in France. But these crowds were really different. They were super happy. I mean, everybody was having a really great time. Um, so it was, like I say, it was very different from the crowds that I encountered in France. But the other thing that I did was, do you know who Hilda Hogwarts or Hogwarts is? A Dutch quilter. She makes quilts with African prints. They're actually the Dutch wax prints that are
Mhm.
sold to West Africa. So they're the big, bold, graphic, colorful prints. And one of her quilts that I love is actually a kaleidoscope quilt that's made out of these African quilts.
See, and I love that. That's
Yeah,
what I'm sort of off center, not perfectly symmetrical. Yeah.
yeah. And I saw her work at the Birmingham show before the pandemic about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was so impressed. I reached out to her and I said, "Hey, I'd love to meet you." So it took us 5 years to meet, but I got to see her in Nantes. I got to see her in Amsterdam. She drove me out. It's about an hour and a half outside of Amsterdam, and we went to the warehouse where the factory is for the Dutch wax
Oh,
prints. And she's in Quilt National, so I'm going to see her there. So
that's
it's,
so
it's great when you make new friends and you start crossing paths again. And, we had some very deep soul sister bonding time, just like you and I have done in the past. It's
Well,
what
that's
I
one of the
call,
things quilting
yeah,
has taught me is you just never know when you're going to meet your next best friend. It's like when
I know.
teaching, I was like, oh, I can't wait to meet this teacher on the circuit, and then I might not have connected with that person, and it might have been someone in my class who became that person who to this day I'm still really great friends with.
Yeah,
Or you just don't, you just like Evie, we had some lovely experiences, just but that kind of it's like you just don't. That's the beauty of this. It's an industry and a community. You just don't know you're going to
yeah.
meet, you're going to connect with, and that's really beautiful. I'm going
Well,
to tell you who I met the other day.
who?
On I I showed I put it on on Instagram and Facebook, but I met Bisa Butler. I was
I
so,
saw that. I saw a picture of you with
I know, I
her.
didn't really, I just talked to her for seconds and I was totally tongue-tied. I was like, I brought her some fabric. I wanted, like, I brought about 6 yards of different fabrics. And so when I
Yeah.
said, oh, design fabric, there was a long line. The exhibit in Soho, it's just incredible. Pieces are so huge, but they're just so like, I mean, there she's, Questlove, she's got this image of him and his hair is
Yeah.
all ribboned, beaded, gorgeous stuff. It's the curly
Yeah.
hair, fabulous. So I just so love her. I call myself a patternista. The exhibit was called I Am a Patternista. My interest now is bouncing patterns against each other so much. I know in the last video, I spoke to you a little bit about how I think what's so different about me is that I camouflage the seams, but I also think it's that I love to use patterned fabrics. I love that, you were talking about, someone who uses solids and stuff like that. But for me, it's about the pattern. Just can't have too much pattern. So same with Bisa. I mean, just how
Yeah.
she chews and the skin tones and everything. I'm just such a big fan of hers. So turned out I didn't even realize there was this long line. And I just got on the line and everyone's talking. I met a quilter and I met, and we're just talking and waiting our turn slowly. And she's lovely to each person and you get to take your photo. I can't do the fabric. And I'd actually recently been in an article with her and Carol Maslumi. Sarah Evans did a very nice article about us, but I
Mm.
didn't show that. But it was just and I met her father and said how amazing I thought she was, and said yeah. And one of the things he said was that so that she's brought quilting, that it's quilting, that she's made quilting a little more people in her world. There's some people a little more aware of it,
Yeah.
and it really is quilting, and it is it's not really, it is patchwork, it's applique, it's magnificent.
Hmm.
Big deal.
I saw
The
one
other
of
thing,
her. I
go
saw
ahead.
one of her large pieces when I visited DC and went to the African American Museum. She has a beautiful, huge piece in their contemporary gallery there, and I was so excited to
They're
see
so
that.
big. And that's
Yeah.
another so fascinating is that, I'm always concerned about my figures and my ground, and I'm trying to keep very active, usually active grounds and blah, blah, blah. And so hers are almost quieter, except the fabric in the back, the textile she picks are all gorgeous. But
Mm.
how it's just perfect that she has these amazing figures against these fairly quiet, considering and big, a lot of just ground
Mm-hmm.
quilts, that's stitched, she on her long arm, but there's never think, oh, you wanted a little more active or or it's just. But I do have one more thing I want to say before we go
Oh,
because
but I also want to tell you another Bisa Butler story. Go
okay.
ahead.
Oh, well, I want to say that last time when we did discuss that I had that, my exhibit in 2009 at the American Folk Art Museum, we didn't mention that you were one of my sponsors. That's
Oh, yeah,
Equilter
that's
was one
true.
of the sponsors, and how enormously CNT, you and another, and how important that was, how to the museum and to me that Equilter, sponsored that exhibit. It was wonderful. So thank you.
That was our pleasure. And, I don't know if people realize this, but we are really the only major retailer who consistently is a sponsor for international and national shows and contests and exhibits. And I try to seek out things that are really unusual and unique, and these days often they're things that I consider activist or, expressing women's voices. That's
Mhm.
that's really important to me. But yeah, that was a pleasure. And we did a video interview with you there, and that was a good time. I came to meet
I think
you,
you
and
had one of your sons, or was that a different time? I'm not sure.
might be a different time. There was one where Sophie came too. Maybe Long Beach or something. I don't know. We'd have to go dig around my video archives there. But I was going to tell you one more thing that might be interesting about Bisa. I met Bisa about 10 or 11 years ago, before she became so famous. And it was on a trip. So Carolyn Maslumi's guild had a trip to South Africa, and it
Mhm.
was like 150 African American quilters who had made quilts for, I think it was the 20th anniversary of apartheid at the South Africa Quilt Show in Johannesburg. And then we were going to do some other touring, including going to Cape Town and out to, on a 1-day photo safari and things like that. But Bisa was there with her husband and her 2 teenage kids. And I got to meet her there. And I just remember she was such a friendly, happy, outgoing, wonderful person. And we traveled with a lot of people. On that trip, the Ferguson riots after the police shooting occurred. And so I was sitting with those women while they were talking about having to give their sons the talk, about how to not get killed if you get pulled over by a policeman. And I guess I kind of knew about that, but to sit with them responding to the riots and the death that had occurred and to hear them talking about it so intimately was really I don't know, a turning point for my awareness. And I appreciated.
And now you've had that ever since. I mean, that was a gift from them in a way. Now you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's been a thrill. I mean, for a while I kind of forgot that I had met her, and then she was on the cover of this magazine, and her quilt was acquired by that museum, and so on. And all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, I think I met her on that trip. Oh yeah, it was that lady with her husband and her kids. So anyway, that's Carolyn Maslumi actually was the person who reminded me. She's like, oh yeah, that's right, that was Bisa on that trip. So,
Sometimes New York doesn't have some, we don't, it happens right now. We have a lot of quilt things happening. There's the Bisa show down at the Dage at the gallery. There's the exhibit at the American Folk Art Museum, what that quilt knows about me, where I'm really proud.
Yeah, you have a piece, right?
I have the piece I gave to the Folk Art Museum, which was one of the 100 best quilts of the century. And tomorrow I'm actually going to meet the curators, the 2 curators who curated that show. So that's exciting. And then also on Thursday, there's the Textile Study Group in New York, and they at PS 108, the El Barrio space, they are mounting quite a good textile show. And I have the Omani arches that I did after my trip to Oman. So yay! So it's really nice to have stuff happening in New York this summer.
Oh, it's great. And it's great that quilts and textile art is getting more and more exposure thanks to people like you and Bisa. So I thank you for that, Paula, because you're really like a founding matriarch of that art quilt movement, and we owe a lot to you. And I feel very fortunate to be your friend and to have your time. And yeah, we probably should wrap it up. I don't know if anybody would want to listen to us go on and on much longer, but you and I always have a lot of interesting things to talk about. So I hope that I do see you soon this year, and just continue to reap the awards of all your work and all your creativity and your generosity, because I know that has a lot to do with it.
And when I think of you, generosity is certainly one of, and creativity is definitely 2 of your major talents, and articulate.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying so. Well, I think that we will say goodbye for now. And I thank everybody who made it to the end of our long, chatty, gossipy a little Zoom here. And we hope you enjoyed it. And who knows, maybe we'll get together and gossip some more in the future. So take care, Paula. Thanks, everybody.
We could go on the road and just have invite a different person each time to see what happens.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thank you. Goodbye, Paula. I love you. Take care. And we'll meet again soon. Bye-bye.